Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 165. And this episode, we're sort of continuing a little bit of what we talked about last episode as far as long-running franchises, but this time we want to talk about what it is that keeps a series going, what keeps it vibrant, what keeps it fresh, what keeps it in people's heads as the years go on, because some franchises and series have been around for a long time and had maybe a few entries, a ton of entries, and others, maybe they came out in like 2003 and are in the top 10 for most entries in a series. Call of Duty.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we talked about what makes a franchise successful, and there's some overlap there into what makes a running franchise like continue on and people keep coming back for more. I think the entry points that we talked about last week is a big part of that, right? That conversation of like how you can jump in, where you can jump in. I mean, to rip the Band-Aid off on Final Fantasy really quick, because I think it's going to be the simplest to talk about, is they just do what they want. On some level, I mean, that's whether you think 16 was a success or not, it's clear that the teams over at Square Enix that work on Final Fantasy kind of figure out what they want to do for this entry and pursue it. Now, there have been other things that have kept this franchise alive besides that. We, as of when recording, are just past the release of Final Fantasy Rebirth, the sequel in the trilogy of retelling the Final Fantasy VII story.
Because Kingdom Hearts just wasn't complicated enough. We needed to do this to a remake of a previous story.
Right. And, like, you could argue that that's another thing to keep the franchise successful. But if you talk to folks who are playing 7 for the first time through this, like, it is very clear now by Rebirth that this is a somewhat of a sequel story. I won't get into spoilers in case folks haven't played Remake, but the idea is that this is not just a retelling of 7, it's adding and changing things. And so that is definitely a way to engage with the previous audience of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy. But newcomers, I often hear, are confused, unsure. So it's clear that this sequel of a sequel, I don't know, was created for, I think, with the intent mostly of old fans, but still making it accessible on some level for new fans. And that can be a dangerous road to walk. You know, I think Final Fantasy walks this road of each game is different, so any one game can be your first Final Fantasy. But I do feel like some entries, as we discussed previously, are more accessible than others. But ultimately, this anthology method, which a lot of other game franchises do, does make it, I think at least, something that's easy to come back to, therefore making it successful because any one of them can be your first Final Fantasy.
Yeah, because the last episode is very much, what's the best way to get into a long-running franchise? And now we're talking about what keeps the long-running franchise going or keeps you coming back. Final Fantasy and any of those other sort of anthology or episodic franchises, it definitely allows you to lapse and return. To go to another series that we talk about a lot, and certainly talked about a lot last episode, Like a Dragon, if you played Yakuza 1, Yakuza 2, and then got back into it in Yakuza 6, there'd be a lot missing. Even still, playing Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, I have moments where I'm seeing flashbacks or moments from previous main protagonist Kiryu Kazuma's perspective that I go, did this actually happen in the games, or is this just kind of a reference to something? I don't know. Either way, the effect is had. I just don't get it. When you have a more episodic storyline format or an anthology, you can go away and come back. If you played Final Fantasy IV and then played Final Fantasy X, you're not missing the storyline beats that happened in between, maybe just some recycled props and sets. It's funny, in doing my research and in putting things together for this episode, kind of fell upon a few major headings of how strongly you adhere to previous entries in a way, or different ways that you adhere to entries. Mm-hmm. The 4 main ones that I came down on were arcade, ongoing storyline, episodic, and mythological. Something like Final Fantasy is absolutely one of those episodic games. I would put Mario as one of those kinds of games, not an arcade title, because there again, you've got same characters, same ideas. You almost think about it like a theater troupe, where you have your actors, but they aren't necessarily playing the same characters all the time, but they will do archetypes. And there again, Final Fantasy, well, we've got all these cactuars. Let's throw some cactuars at them. Kind of feeling of, well, we're traveling around with our troop, our bag of tricks, our pieces that we make and the things that people recognize. People want that sort of character, that sort of thing to get referenced before because people are coming back and seeing the King's Men every time, whatever that may be.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about games like Mario and Zelda and Persona and Final Fantasy is that these are games that if you've played the other games, it fills in the world, the references will be clearer. But if you haven't played the other games, it's a standalone story where you won't really lose that much from not knowing the previous stories. For example, like Bowser, you know he's going to kidnap the princess or an entire kingdom or take over
he is
a kingdom.
Antagonist. Whatever,
Right.
whomever or whatever he is capturing, he is antagonist. And a lot of that depends on whether or not the princess feels like doing some action today.
Right. But if you didn't know that, the game will tell you in the opening minutes, at least for the most of the platformers, 3D and 2D wise.
Here in Fair Verona, where we, where we stomp our Goombas.
Right. And so I think that is another way of keeping a franchise fresh and bringing new people in a way that other games we'll talk to. And I think Yakuza falls into this a little bit, like the more episodic, the more previously on. When story refers to story, you could feel lost, but also those games have found ways, like a Dragon franchise very specifically, to still invest you in the current story, even if you don't understand the stories that came before.
Right. And it's funny where my division has come up here. I would not call Zelda an anthology series. I would put that under mythological because, well, I was writing this up. I created mythological as a heading because of Zelda, because it's sort of a hybrid of anthology and ongoing.
Right.
Because I would never attempt to create a, storyline for all the Mario games. I would never try to do a Mushroom Historia. Nor would I ever even have like a flashback to previous levels necessarily. But you're allowed to revamp and reinterpret previous Zelda titles because you're different links, different pieces of the timeline. But I don't know if I would enjoy like a throwback dungeon as much as a revisited Mario stage. Mm-hmm. And so there's a little bit of being beholden to the past, but not necessarily, which is why I put it under mythological. It's as much of a interpreted within the world itself as there is for us. The canon is a bit loose, even within the setting of the game itself. Kind of my division point of ongoing versus anthology is I see stuff like Yakuza, Like a Dragon, where almost each game is a season of a show.
Right.
And so you can refer within that season, you have your big bad or whatever that is as our current television storytelling style goes. But anthology things, yeah, you can kind of refer to stuff, but those are themselves episodic. They're more of the wanderer. You have Shantae just rolling in whenever problems come along. Something's going wrong before the cream sits out too long and she's got to whip it, like that kind of a thing. Guybrush Threepwood and Monkey Island, Adult Christian in the East series, these are, you can follow that same character, but they're just kind of rolling in, whatever it is. And it's more light reference than something like a Dragon where, there's a lot more heart to it, certainly. And that's not a knock on the other series at all, but that's just kind of where those sit.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of these major dividers that you're talking about, while we're still talking about the things within the games that bring people back, they are either narrative driven or not, too, right? Narrative plays,
True.
I think, a big important part in this. And narrative plays a big important part in why people come back to certain franchises or will join in on a new franchise. And I think mechanically that can be true too. I think about Super Mario 64, and you could have never played a Mario game before that, but then you see this cool 3D game that plays differently on this new console with this weird controller. Well, I want to try that and jump in that way too. And I think sometimes how the games are made is almost irrelevant. Like a Dragon's a great example. It's not a coincidence that they started with a new protagonist in the same game that they started with a new gameplay style. And I think that's another thing that keeps a long-running franchise going. Like, it's why I brought up the 2D to 3D conversion of Mario. Mechanically, major changes can also revitalize a franchise and bring in a new audience. Going backwards can too. You think about how sort of pseudo-successful 3D Sonic was. It had its ups and downs for many years. And then Sonic Mania comes out. It's a return to form. It's 2D. There's some abilities that carry over, new characters, old characters. But because they return to a previous gameplay style, it also revitalized that franchise and kept it going. I don't know that there is a right answer to what you change in your game mechanically to bring people in. I do know there are several wrong answers, and we'll get to that. But like, I feel like major mechanical changes is kind of agnostic to the kind of game you're making, because as long as you're willing to make some major changes within it, that can also breathe new life into this franchise that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, it's that ever-present push and pull of what do you keep, what do you change? You don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel every time you make a new Bomberman game, let's say.
Right.
If you look like Bomberman, you set bombs, I think we're going to be okay. But how many times can we have the same gameplay loop for certain things before people start to either find it stale or a problem, and how far can you deviate? And it's interesting to see which titles, which franchises more heartily weathered the 2D to 3D jump, which ones are doing okay with the idea of single-player, multiplayer, games as service. I mean, personally, I feel like games as service, no one's doing it well.
Yeah, I mean,
even if they're succeeding.
Right. I mean, I would argue that Destiny does it the best at this point because they've been doing it the longest. And even then, their last expansion didn't do as well as they had hoped. They laid off a ton of folks, which we talked about. And like, now the final shape is coming. I don't think it's out yet, but this is supposedly the end of the Destiny 2 story, like the Fallen King was for Destiny 1. This is the big, like, we're wrapping up this story. So in theory, they'd be moving on to a new thing. I think the biggest problem with games of service is if you are only a games of service game, you could find success. Like, look at Helldivers, which has been Helldivers 2 specifically, which is a sequel to a much different kind of style game, has found huge success recently. It's also cross-platform with PC and PlayStation, but like, people latched onto that game. I don't know that even the Helldivers 2 team predicted this. I mean, and they didn't. It's obvious with the server issues and other things. Like,
oh yeah,
they
weren't ready.
They weren't ready, but they are ecstatic and they are working to upgrade and like move forward, and it's working really well for them. But then you look at a game that came out only a month ago, Suicide Squad, which is from Rocksteady, a great studio that made a great series of Batman games, and then created this live service third-person shooter game within the same world. Even when to us, the audience, it seemed like this was going to fail, they continued to push. And it's unclear where that kind of direction comes from. And I think the thing about changing mechanics or the style of game, like if they had made another Batman game, we would have bought it. Everyone would have bought it and played it, but they didn't want to do that. They wanted to do something different, which, look, video games take a long time to make. So I get that. Doing this for as long as they're doing, they want to do something different. It totally makes sense.
And one might argue that it would be the Batman series, the Arkham series, no longer having Kevin Conroy with us.
Yeah.
It would feel wrong in one way or another to have a new Batman. Things move on all the time, but also that could be a way they were going at. And I actually don't know if I saw any interviews or anything saying that, but I could easily see that being a part of the decision.
I mean, yeah. I mean, Kevin Conroy does reprise his role as Batman in this game, but it's like he's a boss instead of a playable character. So who knows how long, if they knew what it was planned for.
Whatever it was. And yeah, that's all speculation, and I'm going to leave that on the table.
Right. But I think there's this need for business to interfere with video games, and I get it. Of course you want to make money. That's how things continue on. Art should be free, but it can't be if we want to sustain in this capitalist society. That said, to make hard shifts, sometimes it's not the studio's decision, it's other folks. I mean, you think about the tacked-on multiplayer, something that I think kept the Assassin's Creed series in theory going, but I don't know if the developers agreed or if it was a studio note, it's hard to say, was the baked-in multiplayer, a thing that was huge in the Xbox 360, PS3, and Xbox One, PlayStation 4 period, where you have this incredible single-player game and you add a multiplayer thing to it. I think of Last of Us 1 and factions, or maybe that was Last of Us 2. I can't remember which one. I think it was Last of Us 1 had factions. And all the Assassin's Creed games had a multiplayer thing. The later Uncharted games had a multiplayer thing. And they were never the main focus of the game, but they were trying to figure out some way after this 10 to 20-hour campaign to keep people invested in the ecosystem. And that can work to extend the life of your franchise and bring it success. I think about Mass Effect 3 adding multiplayer when none of the Mass Effects had it, and then that multiplayer actually affecting the main story. Cool idea, but was an added challenge that for those who don't want to play online, can't play online. So much so that when they re-released the trilogy in a remaster, which we'll talk more remasters in a minute, they remove that multiplayer and they remove that mechanic that the multiplayer affects your resources. And so it's not always clear when these companies pivot, when we're talking mechanically, if it's just their decision to try something new or if it's a decision on high from these larger companies like EA and Activision, Xbox, PlayStation, to add something for quote unquote replay value that they think will print money.
Right. Whether it's replay value or whatever the hot new buzzword is kind of thing, even outside of video games, but more in the world of tech, we need to integrate AI into our thing. No, we don't. That's not going to do anything. AI, whatever management has been told or whatever thing where that's going to make you money or that's going to keep you current. Whereas on the engineer side, it's sort of that's patently ridiculous, but I can't tell you that. Okay, kind of thing. Personally, I've never been much for online multiplayer unless it is exclusively an online multiplayer game. And I don't love a ton of those myself. So this is me speaking from a curmudgeon standpoint. But yeah, the fact that a lot of remakes and remasters of games from 2 generations past that have done away with those multiplayer pieces show that they're vestigial, that they're just kind of an attachment. And the amount of articles, YouTube content, whatever else of folks talking about, well, here are trophies and achievements that we can never, ever get now because of online factors, other things that the servers are down. This can never go anymore. I play games on the Vita, on the 3DS that have network connectivity that no longer matters, either because nobody's playing the game anymore or because Nintendo took down the servers. Nintendo is not a tiny company. This isn't like, they're not around anymore. You just can't log on to servers with Pokemon anymore. That's, for me, a real visual of you want longevity, but these are very short-sighted kinds of things. And for a company, for a business, for whatever, they're probably not thinking about the previous entry the same way that we might be. But for us, the consumer, if we are thinking about the previous entry and what has fallen apart in the time since, that gives us hesitation in buying into the next one. So it is still a factor.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between that and to extend the life of your franchise, you are multiplayer from the start. I mean, we jokingly mentioned Call of Duty before, but also Halo, Gears of War. These are games that had some kind of multiplayer baked into the game and was almost required. But like even Halo met a stumbling block with Infinite when it had such a poor launch of its multiplayer, had live service and all of those things baked into it that didn't seem to go well. I've heard since that it has found its audience and people do play it, which is great. But like Halo was always a very impressive single player story that was pretty streamlined and short. And then the life of those games were the multiplayer and adding things to the multiplayer and creating customizations within the multiplayer, not necessarily pivoting the gameplay as a whole, but pivoting some of the ways you engage in the gameplay.
Yeah. I would be more inclined to try more online multiplayer options if those multiplayer modes allowed for couch co-op.
Yeah.
And I understand what a resource strain doing couch co-op can be on a game. And if you are mostly going for servers and online stuff and putting that structure in there, why split things? I get that. But in my home, I have a fellow gamer who also likes playing games, and especially if there's a multiplayer thing and we go, can we play it together? If the answer is no, the game really has to sell itself for us. Whereas a game like It Takes Two, where it's built around the idea of couch co-op and figuring that out, we devoured that game. It was incredible.
Yeah.
And I don't know where things are these days in terms of games that can do both, that do couch co-op while also doing online. I mean, I am waiting for my physical copy of Baldur's Gate 3 to arrive for the PS5 before I test that, because I'm currently playing online with friends, but I'll be doing couch co-op when that arrives. But that's a factor for me in terms of whether or not I buy into these things that are either multiplayer forward or baked into what they are. And Baldur's Gate 3 is a computer RPG, one of those kinds of, you want a few people working on this. Gears of War, Halo, any of those are shooters. And those have always had a strong online multiplayer component to them. And I think of the local for Halo because I actually never went on the Halo 2 servers. I had friends who did. I would hang out with them while they did it and just were like, would shake my head even as a college-age boy listening to other people on chat. It was nuts. But Halo 1, I remember in high school bringing Xboxes to other people's houses and doing the 8-player multiplayer, and my God, that was incredible. And while that may not exactly sell more units, it gets people excited, and I have a lot of nostalgia for that. And if there are games that allow for that, I mean, I know we live in a very different kind of social world these days, but those also are good for longevity, for customer goodwill in buying the next one, in fighting fatigue of what your franchise is improving or not improving, or what features fall away. If you are going, well, why am I spending $70 on this game if it's going to be obsolete, dead in 2 months, 6 months, a year, and you're selling me the next one? I can't keep that up.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring this up because I think this leads into another thing that can affect a franchise's health, and I'm reminded of fighting games, specifically the Smash Brothers franchise, a game that you could make or break by the couch co-op. That's how I often played it. And when Smash Brothers Ultimate came out, arguably the best game in the franchise, literally because it has everything, though I don't know that I would agree with that, it had couch co-op, and it also had online multiplayer. The online multiplayer is abysmal. And because it's so bad, as a lot of Nintendo's online multiplayer has been in the past, though it seems to be getting better slowly, very slowly, I would play online a little bit with friends in Discord. We'd all agree to go on and take turns and chat through the 4-player matches, but it's not conducive to just regular quick play online, not easily anyway. And that kind of killed that franchise for me. I love Smash Brothers. I've been playing them since Smash Brothers since the N64. But the joy in that was being goofy with friends and playing. And when there was a hurdle to doing that, its story mode didn't appeal to me. It's no Subspace Emissary. Few things are. Think about that as extending the life of Smash Brothers. Smash Brothers Brawl had a full baked-in story mode with cutscenes and a narrative, something that the series has yet to do again. They've done shades of it, but not quite. And I have no idea why that hasn't come back, because everyone I talk to who played Subspace Emissary says, this is incredible. I hope the next one has it. And it has yet to do that. We could never see another Smash Brothers. I believe in letting Sakurai rest, but we'll see.
Maybe they come out with just a single player adventure.
Yeah.
They've already got all the characters there. Just have it go. I don't know.
But that's one of those franchises that the couch co-op being stronger than the online multiplayer and not really doing couch co-op anymore, just because that's kind of how life has pivoted. A lot of games focus on online multiplayer instead of couch co-op. It really killed that franchise for me. In an opposite way, though, I became obsessed with Street Fighter 6 when it came out last year because it had great netcode, which is so important for fighting games.
Oh, yeah.
And had a fun online lobby system that I was able to play with a bunch of friends, take turns, talk trash, and that revitalized my love of fighting games for a short time in a way that it hadn't. And that is something that I think is vital to long-running fighting game franchises, is that your netcode has to be solid. Because if it's not at launch and people can't play and there's input delay, it kind of kills the way we modernly play fighting games in a way that wouldn't have mattered in the arcades back in the day when Street Fighter 2 Turbo came out, but is kind of essential now. And that has nothing to do with mechanics or content, really. It has to do with literal technology that pushes these games forward, which I think you can't even necessarily always predict for, but you have to for sure try and aim for.
A lot of the watershed titles that we think of for all sorts of consoles and all sorts of platforms, I mean, Matt, you were talking about Mario 64 earlier. A lot of those exist because of the technology, and Mario games in particular, certainly earlier ones, were flexes about what they could do with the tech. The original Super Mario Brothers was meant to be sort of the thesis statement of look at what we can do with the Famicom, the ultimate Famicom game. And then they started doing mapper chips and everything else, and here we are. But game design and technology go hand in hand together is, I'm not going to say crucial, but it is part of the very fabric and backbone of this media, this hobby, this lifestyle we're all sharing on some level or another. And so if you want to go online forward, if you want to take the arcade experience and bring it home, online's the way to do it. And netcode is crucial in that, being able to do rollback, being able to do any of those pieces so that if you can't necessarily be next to the person and trash talk each other, you at least should be able to feel like you can't blame the controller. Unfortunately, the notion of technology and design going hand in hand can make it difficult for when remakes and remasters happen. Some games it's a lot easier than others, but some relied so much on either the shape of the controller or the time that they came out or whatever. This is what's being run into a lot with companies like Digital Eclipse in bringing back arcade titles. That's more of the specific physical limitations. But you run into some of those design problems in other remakes as well.
Yeah, and I think bringing up remasters, remakes, and re-releases, all of them for this episode at least are an even playing field, your preference aside. And we've done whole episodes on the difference and why they're important and how they're done well. But I think especially in this current console generation of when we're recording of the Switch, the PlayStation 5, and the Xbox Series S and X, those are so much more important because we've had multiple generations now who haven't played certain games. And like, I can't tell you how many people who played The Link's Awakening, like they'd never had a video game console, but they got a Switch in the pandemic. They'd never really played a Zelda game. And then The Link's Awakening remake comes out, looks cute as hell. And they're like, oh, I'll try it. And fell in love with the Zelda franchise over a Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, which can seem overwhelming. I think that good remasters and remakes have an important place in extending the life of a video game series. I mean, we're joking about it before, but Final Fantasy VII Remake, before we knew the true scope of that game, other than it was going to be 3 games, got a lot of folks our age really excited, but also got a lot of folks much younger than us excited because they're like, oh, I never played that game. I don't have a PlayStation. Also, the graphics were rough. I'm excited to try this new thing and see if it holds up to that hype of that old thing.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, you and I growing up being the age that we are, the age bracket that we are, where it's like, yeah, we grew up with the NES. We grew up with 8-bit graphics and some older stuff, and that's all fine, well, and good. And, you know, what are you damned kids saying about how bad our graphics are, rah, rah, rah. But then I started playing Atari 2600 games, and I went, oh, I get it. Yeah, there are some things that, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to do what? There's a button on the back of the console I'm supposed to hit so that I can navigate the space game? Oh, screw you, buddy, kind of thing. So, yeah, getting to see, you know, Final Fantasy VII, a game that even if you never played it, it looms large in the gaming zeitgeist, one way or another. Whether you know the details or not, you know of it. It exists. And then you look at it, yeah, and it's like little blocky graphics or pre-rendered backgrounds, and that may not be for you, or you may just want to know more. What's going on? And then Remake comes out, and it's focusing just on that big cyberpunk city that drew all of us in 1997 from the demo kind of thing. And now we're going to get to explore it more, and we're going to expand on it. And boy, howdy, did they. Like, yeah, that's going to get all of the old fans, like, you know, certainly me, excited. But the fact that, yeah, it's an entry point for a lot of other folks to get to experience it, to get to see it, that's great for the series. It's great for games, I think.
Yeah, and I agree. I think, though, there are ways in which this stuff doesn't work. The most famous case I can think of, because it soured me pretty hard, was the Super Mario 3D All-Stars pack. You know, It's playing off of the Mario All-Stars pack for the Super Nintendo, which was a great value and a great port of games. Really great, like quality of life stuff to make Mario Brothers 1, 2 US, Lost Levels, 3, and make them all look better and control a little better. And then also in some versions had the latest game, Super Mario World, on it as well. A great value. And so when Nintendo advertised that they were going to make a 3D All-Stars pack, and it was going to be Super Mario 64, Galaxy 1, and Sunshine, no Galaxy 2 for some reason, already made people curious. But then we're like, okay, well, that should still be fun. And then they release it. And then the most bare-bone ports, they don't have quality of life improvements, like just based on the new controller that you're using. They just reassigned stuff. Like they remapped the C buttons to the right analog stick, which in theory, I get the logic, but like doesn't really work for Mario 64, not well at least. And those kinds of things are a giant bummer. Now, if I had an N64 controller, which the Switch does make, and played Mario 64 that way, probably would work because it is a direct one-to-one port. it's kind of a bummer when Nintendo, because on their online service for the different consoles, when they bring stuff over, they also bring stuff like versions over where you're already at the final boss and you can quickly get through it. There are save states. Like the 3D All-Star Pack doesn't even have save states. Like simple things that they can add to extend the life and bring new people into this existing franchise, they don't bother with. And I think that's when remasters, remakes, and re-releases are at their worst, when you just kind of throw it out there. Now, it being available versus not being available in a vision of preservation, which we often talk about on the show, is important. I'm glad they exist. I'm glad I have all three of them on my Switch. But if I have them on my Switch, but I can't really play them well, like, then kind of what's the point? Like, at least with Skyward Sword, when it was re-released, it wasn't great. Because Skyward Sword isn't great, I think, for a lot of reasons.
I think Sarah would beg to differ, but we haven't tried the Switch version.
But like, at least they made an attempt with the remapping of the controls, adjusting the motion controls so you didn't really need them, so you could use the right analog stick for like aiming Link's sword. It doesn't work great, but it works. And like, I got pretty far in it. But at least there's an attempt there, right? This is a game that came out generations ago. You want to bring in a new audience, so you throw some things into it that makes it more accessible, makes it play better on this current console. But when remasters are just kind of tossed out with no improvements, it shows, I don't know if it's a lack of care or a lack of foresight or just a lack of logic. Like, it's hard to say why it happens, but it happens often enough that I feel like it's not just, oh, it accidentally happens or it's a fluke. There's some intent there.
Yeah, and I think it is a real detriment when these remasters, these re-releases, whatever, can then retroactively sour you to the game.
Yeah.
3D All-Stars, I was excited about, not necessarily because I needed it in my collection. I remember saying when it was announced and, oh, it's going to be a limited time, whatever, like, I already have those games. I have them on their original consoles. This release isn't for me. That doesn't mean I'm not excited that this release is happening, especially because Super Mario Sunshine is one of those games that everybody's got a different opinion about it. Everybody is either like, oh, it's the greatest game ever, it's the worst game ever, it killed the GameCube, whatever it is. Personally, I think it's a really good game. It's a lot of fun. It's very different than a lot of other Mario games. And Mario Galaxy was kind of the switch to Mario Sunshine's Wii U of they were trying some stuff out and this is what's getting everybody going. And it certainly did. But Sunshine's worth revisiting. I remember having a bit of a sour opinion about it, and then seeing some speedruns and taking some time and going back to it. And yeah, I freaking love that game. Sarah kind of had the same journey as well, where she didn't play it a ton back then, and revisiting it, we're both like, yeah, this is a really good game. Is it the best game? Does it need to be? Who cares? It's a really good game. But if people have sort of the corners of popular opinion that it's a disappointing game, and then they play a disappointing port of it, then yeah, it's forever going to be a disappointing game. That's no good from a preservation side. That's no good from a franchise health side. That's no good for any of that. And yeah, I completely forgot when talking about technological or physical limitations, anything with motion control or touchscreen, bringing over any sort of dual screen games, the World Ends With You, Neo being an example that I'm thinking of right now, where how do you make those things work? They're figuring it out better now these days. Because Ghost Trick came out recently, I haven't had a chance to play it, but I heard good things. And I mean, that was a game I slept on back in the day. So the fact that it's coming back, here we go. And that's not even really a franchise as far as I know, but it's got these things happening. Where a game that I have currently been playing, or a series I've been playing through, is the spin-off to Persona Q, that is built off of the Etrian Odyssey series. And I feel like there's some people where all of that is just gobbledygook. Etrian Odyssey was pretty much DS, 3DS, dungeon crawling, dungeon drawing games that I knew I would love. It was never quite where I would drop my $40 when I found it new, and now it's super hard to find. But there's a Switch release. It's got the Origins collection on the Switch now that, yeah, it's $80, but it's got the first 3 games, and I don't know what's going to get the later ones, but I'm interested in seeing how that plays out, where a game that is built on looking at the lower screen and drawing the dungeon as you go, you've got a widescreen. And I think that's how they play it out, if I'm remembering correctly. So there's ways to go about it, but you're right, Matt. An old, cool game, people can try to track it down, whatever else. But if you re-release it, there's a weird kind of, you are judging it on its nostalgic merits, but you're also judging it as a new game with a little bit of a nostalgia bump to it. So it does still have to perform to be considered a decent entry into things. So I don't know. I haven't had a chance to play the Chrono Cross re-release that came out a little while ago, but I remember Chrono Trigger on the DS being an absolutely phenomenal remake, one that they put a lot of love and care into. That was really how I first finished that game and what really got me and Sarah as converts to the series.
And it's considered one of the most definitive versions of Chrono Trigger as well to this day.
There you go.
I mean, yeah, and I think remakes and remasters are also really important because they can breathe new life into a franchise when you go back and do it well. I think of the Yakuza / Like a Dragon franchise and its success, and while Yakuza 0 is an original new game, Kiwami 1 and Kiwami 2, which are remakes of the first two games that were on PlayStation 2, completely revamp everything and are, I think, instrumental in that series becoming popular overseas. You know, 0, Kiwami 1, and Kiwami 2 were all around the same time within the same series of years, though I don't know the order, but they all were all integral in breathing new life into this franchise that had been out already for a while, that has now become one of the biggest things in games and one of Sega's most successful franchises at this point. I would argue more successful than some of their others that were their flagships in the past. And then also with Final Fantasy, talking about remasters, just making the game playable is good. But like, for example, Final Fantasy IX, which I've talked about on the show, has become one of my favorites now. Whether it trumps 7 or not is hard at this point. I think it's my number one favorite now. But part of that is because I got to play it on the Switch, and it had quality of life upgrades like turning off random battles or making all of your damage 999 damage so you instantly kill everything. So you can get through the tough spots if you get really stuck. But you don't have to turn those on. You can leave them off and still play the game as is. And all of the Switch entries, which I think are based on PC entries that also had these, like all of them, I think 7 through 12, except for 11, which was an MMO, all have these kind of quality of life upgrades and were ported to consoles and PC with these upgrades. So you can experience these games, but still have these little tricks that can help out if you get stuck. You know, not necessarily adding a difficulty mode, but adding little things that could be considered essentially the equivalent of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For me, I played Final Fantasy IX on the PS1. So for me to play it on PC, it's a little less crucial for me to have those. But you know what? I imagine if I played through and I had those at my fingertips, I would play with them a little bit. I'd have a little bit of fun just to see what's up. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I mean, to continue the Final Fantasy idea, the pixel remasters.
Yep.
Are they necessarily the definitive versions of any of these games? Possibly, probably not. Depends on which one you're looking at and what you consider definitive. But they are the most accessible.
Yeah.
And that is not a bad thing. Accessible is not a dirty word for this, especially when you consider something like the original Final Fantasy. My first Final Fantasy, a lot of people's first Final Fantasy. I went back a couple of years ago and finally, as an adult, played through and beat it on the NES. I finished the damn thing. I did it. Felt so good about it. Would I want anybody else to do it? No. And I will probably go back and play that NES version again. I've got a lot of love and nostalgia and care for it, and I kind of played it and lived through it at the time when that was fine. But am I going to make Sarah play it? No. God, no. We're playing through Final Fantasy games haphazardly, just kind of either both of us for the first time or her for the first time, whatever it is. If we're going to play the original Final Fantasy together, I will probably do Pixel Remaster with her. That's the version that makes the most sense. The mobility that you get, the way that they designed the battle system and some of the building things, because certainly for Sarah, she hates grinding in RPGs. I know she's not alone in that. She is certainly not alone in that. A lot of times grinding in RPGs is comfort for me.
Yeah.
But still, there comes a point where I'm like, okay, this is getting ridiculous. There's a saturation point. The original Final Fantasy was definitely built on the grind. When I streamed it a while back, I remember off stream having to take, of course, I also built an absurd party. It was nothing but monks. I still think I made the right decision. But those 4 monks, I needed to take them to like the Peninsula of Power, to the little grind spot, get them up another like 5 or 6 levels off stream so I didn't have several hours of me just hanging out being like, so how you guys doing? This is fun, right? You having a good time? Yeah, there's those ogres again. Oh, baby. Yeah, let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. Perfect. And let's enjoy Final Fantasy for what it is. Final Fantasy 1, I can't believe it's not a first edition D&D adventure that launched 1,000 jobs. And I mean that in terms of fighter, thief, white mage, red mage, black mage. And I think that's worth playing and having it in an accessible point that people can turn on and off certain pieces to play of it what they want to play and enjoy of it what they want to enjoy. I think certainly for remakes and remasters and revisits, that's crucial. You need to ease the pain points. If people are going to worry about, oh, you're doing away with this challenge or you're doing away with that thing, 9 times out of 10, you can go and play the original game in some form or another. I give that sort of dismissal not lightly and not to everybody. But if you are the sort of person that is worried about that, chances are you are also somebody who holds on to their older systems or who holds on to those older games. So if you're jonesing for that challenge, first take on the challenge of getting to the older game because it still exists. Not always. And again, that's where I get mad about games as service and other matters because then you can't. But if you're going to keep the series healthy, alive, by bringing in new people, by showing what came before, let those new people enjoy it in a modern context. So yeah, accessibility is paramount.
I think what's really great, like I played through the Final Fantasy IV Pixel Remaster, is that all of those options are toggleable. They're not required. So if you still want to do the grind, if you still want to play this game as originally intended, you can mostly do that. And so I think those kinds of options are the best. I think forcing people to play games a certain way, both harder or easier, is less fun, depending on the game that you're making. But like giving those options for people to try it on a harder difficulty, try it on an easier difficulty, turn off certain things, turn on certain things, I think are absolutely helpful and part of what makes something continue on. It's important also to talk about the failings, and we've talked about some of them. You know, I think the conversion to 3D, while some games got it really right, like Mario 64, other games got it really wrong, and it kind of was the death knell for those franchises, or so it seemed. I think about Bubsy 3D and how that pretty much tanked that franchise, which wasn't admittedly a great franchise to begin with.
Yeah.
But then got 2 new releases as 2D platformers not that long ago. You know, I think about the Earthworm Jim franchise, who also absolutely tanked the 3D conversion, and then has shown up in other places, but for most part has stopped existing since. There have been some re-releases and stuff and ports. And again, I don't think any of these games set out to make a bad game. Like, we hated on Suicide Squad for 2 people who have barely played it or not played it at all. Rocksteady didn't intend to make a bad game. They intended to make the greatest version of this game that they wanted to make that they could. And sometimes it's out of your hands whether something is a success or not. Again, Helldivers 2, a very small franchise with only 1 game previously that was completely different, is a huge rocket success. You think about Among Us. Among Us was a game that was going to die, and they were going to work on the sequel and just see if they could hit with that. And then during the pandemic, streamers discovered it, blew up, and then they ended up supporting it. They are working on other things over at Inner Sloth, but like, you can't predict when things will hit or how. And so you do the best to mitigate that. And there are a million ways, as we've talked about in this episode, to do that. But at the end of the day, just even like with the right entry point, there is no definitive, this is the answer, right?
Of course.
Any entry point in a series, like we talked about last episode, could be a great entry point for you if you decide that you want it to be. If you're like, I'm just going to start here. I don't care if I'm confused. I don't care if I don't understand the story. I don't care if I understand the mechanics. I just want to start with this one. So be it. Friend of mine, Kyle Hilliard, over at Game Informer, often says, play the new thing. That's his motto. He doesn't care what came before. Play the new thing. And I think a lot of that goes hand in hand with modern franchises and how they extend their life and how they continue to be successful as well, is every new game that comes out has some kind of entry point for new players. Some have a brick wall, and then you can't really. But for the most part, like I even think about Alan Wake 2, which I loved, also a very short franchise. I guess if you consider Control part of it,
I feel like that starts getting into the splitting hairs of, is it a series, is it a franchise? And I think the ongoing storyline ones, those are series.
But like it had like a brief summary, and like a lot of games now these days, like Rebirth, although I'm not very far in it, has a story so far section. Kingdom Hearts 3 also had a story so far section, where especially Kingdom Hearts needed a lot explained and does that for you and is actually pretty comprehensive. Those kinds of things also help new games in a long-running franchise be a successful entry point and also continue to push forward the success of that franchise, because you are giving people accessibility, like we said, but it's a narrative accessibility versus, you know, I think about the digital comics we talked about with Mass Effect in the last episode. Also key to that franchise surviving and continuing, because when the third game came out on the Wii U and there was no way to play the other two games on that console, those digital comics made it so you may not have understood every nuance to that story, but you knew why you were on Earth. You knew who the Reapers were. Like, you knew the basic stuff to get off and kicking with that storyline.
Yes, absolutely. And no matter what, it's that idea of a good storyteller knows when to begin and when to end their story. And if you extend the timeline enough, all stories end in death, et cetera, et cetera. So being able to pick up whatever the latest game is and do something with it is a crucial piece of what keeps a franchise healthy, keeps everything going. And it's such a tricky thing to do because, yeah, you got to onboard people somehow. And I will always remember the Oddworld series. It was Abe's Odyssey and Abe's Exodus on the PS1. I love those games so very much. I didn't start on the PS1. I didn't start with Abe's Odyssey. I got Abe's Exodus on the PC one Christmas. And I also have confirmed that the PS1 version has this as well. There is an option, like before you start the game, like if you haven't seen the game before, like you pick a new game, you do whatever. Is this your first game? Yes. And you get a cutscene that starts with, in case you was too cheap to purchase our last game, here's a bit about what happened. And there's a whole, like, that level of levity and irreverence that, yeah, it's like, okay, here's who I am, here's what's going on, here's what I'm able to do, off we go. You could skip it, you don't need it, and it was funny as hell. And something like Oddworld, you don't need a Kingdom Hearts level debrief on what's going on. I mean, personally, I feel like Kingdom Hearts would be hilarious if it just starts off with like a 2-minute fever dream that makes more and more sense as you play through the game, and you can just choose to revisit it and go, oh, that's what that is. It's almost like a puzzle box. I don't think that's a commercially viable idea. I just think it's very funny. But it is a challenge of how you keep the latest entry the best entry or the best entry point.
Yeah, an extension of that is sometimes just having a release date in the right time and place also extends your franchise's life. I think about Metroid, a franchise we both love dearly that is not considered a system seller at this point for Nintendo, not even one of their greatest financial successes amongst their main flagship franchises.
Unfortunately.
But Metroid Dread coming out on the Switch, because there were so many Switches in hand and so many people who were like, well, I've never played a Metroid game, but it's the newest one and I have a Switch, I'll try it. It is easily the most successful selling Metroid game ever. And so when they released the remaster of Metroid Prime, it also sold like gangbusters. And I think time and place can also play into that, which is not always something you can even control as someone making a game, but you can get lucky. The Metroid franchise is not known for its narrative, though I love the narrative of it. Those are a lot of just pick up and play games. And so getting one out on a console with a huge install base will get folks to play it. I mean, I think about how the PlayStation is doing, I would say, more successfully than the Xbox this cycle. It's negligible because they're both losing money on console sales. But like, think about the PlayStation 4 becoming also was more successful than the Xbox One. The success of the Last of Us games, God of War, the remake, or retelling or continuation, however you want to call it. Spider-Man. All of those are, yes, because they're very good games, but also because they are in a lot of homes and people can get to them. And we can't ignore that. Sometimes the success of a franchise has nothing to do with how good the game is. Because even if the game is really good, if not enough people are playing it, then it kind of falls to the wayside. I think about the newest Prince of Persia that just came out. Metroidvania got rave reviews, didn't hit sales expectations. That franchise did nothing wrong with this game. The franchise itself has done plenty of things wrong over the years. But this game, they did everything right. They did a new gameplay style. They made it feel like old school Prince of Persia. They added cool difficulty. The story is great. The voice acting is great. Like, I'm a few hours into it and I'm really enjoying it for the most part. But because people weren't clamoring for a new Prince of Persia, or people were like, oh yeah, I want to play that, but it's also coming out the same month as Like a Dragon and other things, and so I'll get to it later. I'm one of those people.
Yep.
It just didn't hit its numbers. And like, we have to remember that no matter, we could talk to death about the things that companies can put in their game to make them better or the processes they can follow, but sometimes it's luck of the draw, simply and purely. And like, this Prince of Persia game should have sold like gangbusters because of quality wise, and it didn't. And it was timing. It's on all major consoles as far as I know as well, for sure Switch and PC. So like, it's hard to say why it didn't sell as well, other than people weren't looking for this game at this time.
There are so many factors and pieces that go into this. This entire discussion that we've been having here is factors. None of it is a solution. None of it is anything else. But it doesn't mean it's not worth talking about and it's not worth exploring, because throwing up your hands and saying, well, it doesn't matter anyway, that's the death of creativity.
Yeah, and I think ultimately there are things you can do to mitigate the things that will make your game a success versus not, especially within a long-running franchise. But those things can only get you so far. But if you do those things, maybe that the luck will be on your side. But at the end of the day, for sure, putting out a piece of crap will not do it. You know, I think about the most recent Call of Duty, a series that I like to pick on because I'm not really a fan of it. But
Same.
people who love that franchise were very upset with the most recent game because it felt like an expansion pack. It didn't feel like a new game. It didn't have enough stuff in it. And when you pride yourself on putting out the latest thing with a great story and a great online multiplayer, and you fail on both counts, people are going to lose faith in that franchise. It's why Sonic fans are as, I'd say, cynical, to put it nicely, as possible. But then Frontiers came out and I really loved it. It wasn't perfect, but like, I think good faith games that do their best sometimes can be enough. But if you're not even putting the effort in to make the game the best it can be, whatever that means, you're definitely going to fall short faster.
And you can put out a game that feels like an expansion pack, but you have to package it and sell it accordingly.
Yeah.
I'm totally fine if the model for game releases shrinks. If the so-called AAA games are smaller, but they're cheaper. The amount of games that are out there, you want people to buy them. You want people to not feel that fatigue, that exhaustion about it. If they're smaller games for a lower price point, people are more likely to pick them up. Think of how many Steam games we all buy when they're on sale.
Yeah.
So many.
So many.
And a lot of folks are buying their games digitally on consoles as well. So you're kind of working with the same model. So if you start from a lower price point and then there's the sales or whatever else, people are going to pick them up. I think that's more likely. And I think that's also going to be a lot better for a lot of companies. But I'm not a business analyst. I am not a manager or anything like that. That's just from where I'm sitting. But yeah, you also run the risk when you work at that high price point, at that big bombast of what you are trying to present yourself as with a heavy release schedule like Call of Duty does, despite the studio rotations. Yeah, when it falls short, that also falls short real bad, and that margin of error gets bigger.
Yeah. It's not to say that Call of Duty can't bounce back. It's not to say any of these franchises can't bounce back, but sometimes it goes beyond the quality of the content, and then sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just the quality of the content, especially when you're dealing with yearly releases. It's why certain franchises have spaced that out, shifted release schedules, all of those things. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. The Assassin's Creed Origins release, you know, a big part of that was wanting to go back to its roots, but also putting time between the games, letting this series breathe and seeing if you can bring in a new audience.
And I feel like all of the Assassin's Creed titles that have gotten any serious play in my house are the ones that are post-Origins. So
Yeah.
certainly on my end, that's successful. If you are relying on people buying the game year in, year out, if there's a bad entry, more people will maybe next year go, we'll see what happens or see how it is. And if you have built up that kind of a structure, that kind of an infrastructure, that kind of an expectation, that can be far more detrimental than a lot of folks realize. There is a great power in regular customers.
Yeah. I mean, I think the last thing to state before we wrap it up is the things that we've talked about with long-running franchises and the things they can do to stay successful are going to get harder if they are AAA games. Think about how many Final Fantasy games we'd get on a specific console back in the day.
Yeah.
PlayStation had 3. The PS2 had...
Technically 3. If you count 10-2.
Yeah. Oh, and 11, which was playable on the PS2.
So 3.5.
But like now we get one game per console generation. I mean, 16 and 15 were console generation apart. You know, a lot of these games, we've only had one 3D Mario game. Well, technically two, because Bowser's Fury is technically a 3D Mario game, but not on the same scale, and part re-release, part remaster. Like, we're just getting less of franchise games on the same console. unless they are by different development studios. I think about the Metroid Prime Remaster and Metroid Prime Dread, which were handled by different studios. Continuing to have that longevity is getting harder, unless you're RGG Studios and then you just put out 3 games a year. They're all great and you move on, which is a
Well,
rarity.
some of them are still remakes.
Right. Some of them are still remakes or remasters, and some of them aren't as good as others, right? Even though they're still good. And so I think we're hitting a time now. I think about the last 2 Pokemon games and how I loved both of them, but they were both extenuatingly flawed because of how crunched they were together, how they weren't up to snuff when they were released. They patched them, but they still had bugs and other things. And now we're going to hopefully, the rumors are true for the new Pokemon game, be on the next piece of Nintendo hardware, which I think it needs. But I think it's harder to just also look at all this stuff and go, well, if you do these things, you'll be fine, because also development cycles for AAA games have gotten so long that we have to wait so long for the next game. And you think about games coming out now for the PS5, they are just barely eking it in. Like, this console cycle probably has another 3 or 4 years. It was stuttered.
So, yeah.
It was stuttered because of the shortages. But I know that developers and console manufacturers are already thinking about the next box. They have to be, because it takes time to make them too. And so trying to develop on such a short amount of time, when the development time is almost as long as the console generation time, you're only getting a couple of games, if even, of that franchise during that cycle. So the shifting factors sometimes can be even so far out of your control that you just roll with it and do the best you can.
Pretty much, yeah. This points to some things needing to shift, some things needing to give, and I don't know in what direction they are, because I think this goes beyond the health of just a long-running video game series.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's something that the video game industry is going to really struggle with in the next few years if the insane amount of layoffs we've seen just this year are anything to go by. And that's why also I think this was a great conversation, but it goes beyond even the factors we can look at, because the video game industry is in an unstable point that it's not been in since the last crash. And we don't even know if we're headed for another crash, but the business is definitely going to have to shift and give one way or the other if these long-running franchises and these studios are going to continue to even exist a year from now.
And more importantly, if the people making them are still going to be able to make them.
Yeah, which is a whole different can of worms. And on that delightfully positive note, we would love to hear from you guys about why you invested in long-running franchises. What was your entry point? We can continue that conversation from the last episode, but also, was there something that a franchise did, whether it was just flashier, shinier, had a better mechanic, had an interesting character? What brought you into that long-running franchise? And what makes you keep coming back to them? For me, I go back to Zelda because it's Zelda. I don't really think much about a Zelda game and whether I want to play it or not. I think, ooh, Zelda, yes, please. But that's not every franchise, and that's not every game that comes out in a franchise. The newer Spider-Man franchise has been a favorite of mine, but I've played Spider-Man games since all the way back on the Super Nintendo because I like Spider-Man, and that's not even the same people making those games. We didn't even really get into licensed franchises and how they run through different developers and have a whole other can of worms affecting their releases. But what brings you into these games and what makes you stick with them through their growing pains, let's say, and keep with these franchises, and if it's things they've done or just things you like about them?
Yeah, are there particular game developers or studios that have sort of earned your fandom or earned your trust over the years because of those things? What are the draw points? What brings you in and what keeps you going? And how do you bring in others on those games and those franchises? Because it's just as important for us to be able to tell someone else why we love them so that they can play it, and then we can talk about it, and we can be so excited about it, and that's incredible, because that is a crucial part of fandom and a crucial part of video games for me. No matter what console it is, how old I am, what games are coming out, being able to share that with everybody is crucial, which is why we love hearing from you. Please get in touch with us. There's so many great ways to reach out. We are Fun and Games Pod across all the social media that we are a part of at this point. Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, Tumblr. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, what you thought of previous episodes, what you'd like us to talk about, and who you'd like us to talk with on future episodes. If you want an all-in-one place to keep up to date with what we're doing, all these episodes, anything we're writing, whatever's going on, you can visit our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. Thank you so much to everyone who has had the means and want to financially support us there, but you can also join as a free member to get updates as well. We also want to thank those who are on the high score tier and above up on the high score board. And today, the high score board consists of Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Luke Lewis, Roger Reichart, Alejandro Alves, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Robert Prine, Sean Bowen, and Wes Bates. Thank you so much for your support. Please enter your initials. We have 3 modes of doing so. We have classic, modern, and future. Future will be coming out in a later patch. You're going to freaking love it. I know a lot of people, like one of you, I think, wanted classic, but, we got you.
You can also rate and review this podcast on your podcast platform of choice. We prefer Apple Podcasts and Spotify because it gets us the most visibility, but literally any platform you listen on that allows you to rate and review, please do it. It only takes a few moments, and it's really how we grow. Financially growing is great, but also growing our audience and this conversation and the interactivity of the podcast is priceless, and we are grateful for it. So if you can just take a moment, please do that.
Yes, and please visit certainpov.com. Check out all the other fantastic podcasts on the network. And also, you can find a permanent invite link to our Discord server where a lot of these conversations continue. A lot of the factors of these episodes are discussed. People are posting the games that they've beaten, and we can discuss why people should or shouldn't get into a series or whatever gaming news is going on. It's another spot where all of this continues, because whether it's on Discord, on Patreon, on social media, or just between us here, we couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
A flaw? Sure you want to go with that?
Hey, everyone?
There we go. More inviting.
Have you ever had a movie that you really wanted to love, but something holds you back?
Or one that you did love in spite of a flaw?
Well, I'm Case Aiken.
And I'm Sam Alisea.
And on Another Pass, we sit down with cool guests to look at movies that we find fascinating.
But flawed.
And we try to imagine what could have been done when they were made to give them that little push.
We're not experts. We just believe in criticism.
Constructive criticism.
Sure.
So come take another pass at some movies with us.
And every now and then, we can celebrate movies that did it on their own, too.
You can find us at certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Pass it on.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.